One of the reasons why I wanted to give this presentation for Wellness Week is because opioid addiction is very close to home for me. A member of my family struggled through an opioid addiction crisis, if you will. And so it's a difficult beast to tame, I can tell you that. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of opioids. We're going to talk about the pharmacodynamics, which is a really big word that in essence means what opioids do to the body, the good stuff and the bad stuff. We're also going to be talking about why people tend to become addicted to opioids. We're going to be looking at some statistical data about the epidemiology of opioid use in the United States. And I think that some of these numbers are really going to floor you when I start passing these numbers along to you. So let's go ahead and start talking about opioids. And of course, I entitled this Old Drugs, Contemporary Problem because you all know that the poppy plant has been around since the inception of time. So opioids are not a new drug. They have been around for a very long time. The problem is, in recent years, we have seen a real resurgence in opioid use, opioid prescriptions, and opioid deaths, unfortunately. Okay, so for today we're going to have some goals and objectives. We're going to be talking about what opioids are and how they affect the body. We're also going to be talking about why opioids are so highly addictive and why people love taking them, why they love taking them. We're going to be looking at the recent trends in opioid prescriptions and the epidemiology of opioid use. We're going to describe the relationship, if any, between opioid prescriptions and heroin use. You all may be aware of the fact that heroin has been the subject or the topic in many national headlines now. Heroin is also making a resurgence or a comeback. We're also going to be talking about how to identify the newest synthetic opioids to surface. And let me tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, they are bad news. The new synthetic opioids. We're going to be talking about those. Bad news. So in my presentation, one thing that I'm inherently asking is opioid abuse, is it really a problem? Because I am one of those individuals that approach the media with some degree of skepticism, because I think the media tends to be alarmist from time to time. So I wanted to do my own research, and I wanted to find out, is opioid abuse, is it really an issue in the United States? And so in my research, I came across just a few headlines, and these are just a few. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So you can imagine then, in its entirety, the troubles of opioid abuse in the United States. These are just a few. Let's talk about the history of opioids. Let's start there. Well, as I said before, opioids have been around for a long time. And you know, as an EMS instructor, I talk to my students about the history of ambulances in the United States. And one of the first ambulances was actually started in mid-1800s in Cincinnati, Ohio. And on those ambulances, they actually carry two medicines to treat pain. Does anyone know what those are? Any guesses? Liquid morphine was one. Whiskey was the other. Did I already talk to you about that in EMT class? Oh, so that's why you knew the answer. Yes, liquid morphine and whiskey were the two medicines actually carried on ambulances in the mid-1900s. So morphine, again, has been around for quite some time. But if you look at my PowerPoint, you can see that actually the Bayer Company is partially to blame, because they're the ones that produced a commercial heroin. Yes, a commercial heroin. Now, it didn't last long, because then the FDA got involved, and they decided, well, heroin is going to be a scheduled medication, so it didn't last long on a commercial basis. However, Bayer Company actually may be partially to blame here. In the 1900s, early injured Civil War veterans were treated with morphine sulfate. Well, was it an appropriate use of morphine sulfate? Probably so. The problem is that those individuals who left the war were morphine addicted. And so that created a snowball effect there. In the 1970s, Percocet and Vicodin were introduced, and those are in fact opioids as well. And then in 1986, this was a paper was published, and it described the treatment of 38 chronic pain patients, and they concluded that prescribed opiates could be prescribed safely on a long-term basis. Now, this was a nationally published article that was read and adopted, or the mentality was adopted by physicians all over the United States and worldwide for that matter. So this was in 1986. In 1996, OxyContin was born. And in 1995 to 1996, the number of prescriptions jumped by 8 million. And then you fast forward to 1998, the number jumped to over 11 million prescriptions. Oh, but we're just getting started. We're just getting started. In 2001, the Joint Commission, and the Joint Commission, let me explain for just a minute, it's a nonprofit organization that in essence accredits health organizations and clinics. Now what they did is they sort of pushed pain as being what they call the fifth vital sign. And so they were addressing pain control and pain management. And they really should be treated as the fifth vital sign, stating there is no evidence that addiction is a significant issue when a person are given an opioid for pain control. Now, they have since backstepped that many times over, and they now say that those words were misconstrued. However, this has been published. And it's something that is out there, and they did in fact call it the fifth vital sign. So let's now look at some of the trends of opioid prescriptions from 1991 to 2013. What do you see? You see a trend in the increase of opioid prescriptions, do you not? You see a steady rise. All the way from 1991, where about 75 million opioid prescriptions were dispensed, all the way up to 2011, where you saw over 200 million opioid prescriptions dispensed. And then what you notice in 2012 and 2013? Well, you see a slight reduction. And this is when it was noted that opioids are becoming a systemic and national problem in the United States. And so since 2012, 2013, physicians are being a little more hesitant in prescribing opioids for pain. There's something I want to interject right here about my personal opinion. And my personal opinion is I am not against opioids, because I believe that people have true acute or chronic pain that needs to be addressed. But as long as opioids are prescribed appropriately and conservatively and for the right reasons, I think they definitely have their place. But they certainly can be dangerous as well. Some of you may have seen this picture. It was all over the national news a year or so ago, I believe. But what happened? Well, around 2010, 2011, when the medical field, they started identifying issues with opioid overdoses and opioid deaths. They started dispensing opioids at a less frequent rate. And unfortunately, for those who had opioid addictions, they had to find something else to go to. They had to turn to something else. So what did they turn to? They turned to heroin. They turned to heroin. And this picture was all over the news. This is actually a picture of a grandmother and a grandfather who injected heroin, but that heroin, unbeknownst to them at the time, was also laced with fentanyl. And their grandson, 4-year-old grandson, is in the back seat. And they're, of course, you can see unconscious and unresponsive. So right now, They are shifting from pills to heroin. And according to the federal government's National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 4 out of 5 current heroin users report that their opioid use began with prescriptions. Okay, so let's look here at this graph. Now, the reason I wanted to throw this graph in is because it suggests that the abusers of prescription opioids are shifting to heroin as prescription drugs become less available or harder to abuse. Now, if you look here, this is the second quarter of 2011, and what I have circled here is heroin use. Now, you notice it spiked in 2011, correct? Well, why is that? Well, if you look at the graph, it is the same time as there's a reduction in prescriptions of OxyContin. So as the OxyContin and other opioid prescriptions drop, heroin use tends to go up. In other words, the addicts are going to get their fill. It doesn't matter how they get their fill, but they're going to get their fill. Let's look at deaths now. Deaths attributed to heroin. And if you look at this chart, it is really quite amazing. It's actually scary in that if you look at 2010, look at the sharp rise in heroin-attributed deaths. And I'm going to talk about how heroin and how OxyContin works in just a moment. But a significant increase in heroin overdoses and heroin deaths. That's for a couple of reasons. Of course, number one, which I've already mentioned, the fact that there is a reduction in opioid prescriptions now. But the other thing is, and the synthetic opioids that are coming from China to Mexico to the United States, they're also being laced with other unknown synthetic drugs. It's kind of like opening up a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Well, it's the same thing with some cases of these synthetic pills. They don't know what they're getting. They just don't know what they're getting. All right, so now let's talk about the physiology, if you will, or pharmacodynamics of how these drugs work. Opioids, in essence, are narcotic pain relievers. They're narcotic pain relievers. And what they do is they bind to these receptors in your brain called MU receptors. They're also called opioid receptors. And when these drugs bind to these opioid receptors, it creates some physiological responses. Now, some physiological responses are very good for the patient. Some physiological responses not so good. The reason why people take opioids is because they want, one, to relieve the pain, two, it gives them a sense of euphoria and well-being. And they like it. And they like it. So what they do, oops, wrong button. So what they do is they bind to these receptors that are built precisely for these opioid drugs. They will bind to those receptors that will sort of start that ball rolling as far as that physiologic response. They will produce sedation. They will produce euphoria, a sense of well-being. And of course, they are prescribed to treat moderate to severe pain. And again, for those who truly suffer moderate to severe pain, either on acute or chronic basis, I am all for treating that pain. No one likes pain. No one wants to live with pain. I have nothing against prescribing opioids again, so long as they are prescribed correctly, conservatively, and if the individual or the patient takes them as they should. In other words, taking them as prescribed. So here's an illustration of how they work. The opioids, keep in mind there's natural opioids and there's synthetic opioids, and I'm going to show that to you in just a moment. But again, they bind to those receptors and then they create that physiologic response. Now, one thing I want you all to understand in this audience is there's different classes of opioids. We have your natural opiates like morphine, like codeine, and opium. We also have semi-synthetic opioids, heroin, hydromorphone, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and now the full synthetics, and these are the ones we're going to be talking about in just a little bit, which are fentanyl, methadone, and the new fentanyl that's making its way that we're going to talk about in just a moment. The bottom line is, even though some are natural and some are synthetic, they all work the same. They all bind to the same receptors. They all cause the same physiologic response, some of which are good and some of which can be very dangerous. All categories, no matter which category they belong to, they all have that risk of overdose. All of them do. Okay, so let's look about some facts about opioids and gender. And when I saw this number, I about came out of my seat. I couldn't believe it. It is the prescription, and of course I bolded prescription pain reliever overdose deaths among women, increased more than 400% between 1999 and 2010. Why do you think that is? Well, I can tell you why they report it as such. They report it as such because they state, and they meaning the authors of these journals and papers, that women tend to have more chronic pain than men do. 400%. Wow. And then heroin overdose deaths among women have tripled just in the past few years. And through 2010 through 2013, female heroin overdoses has increased from 0.4 to 1.2 per 100,000. So in both cases, abuse and deaths are rising. Now let's talk about opioids in teens. In 2015, over 275,000 adolescents were current non-medical users. Okay, so what does that mean? Non-medical users. They were not obtained by prescription, okay? 122,000 had an addiction. These are teenagers. 122,000 were addicted. And interestingly, most who start using opioids and ultimately develop an addiction to said opioids, those are the ones that are given to them by a friend or by a relative. That's how it starts. They were given to them by a friend or a relative. So in 2014, and this is the most recent data I could find about opioid abuse and dependency, 2014, Americans aged 12 or older either abused or were dependent on prescription opioids. In 2014, 2 million. 2 million. Okay, so why do users love opioids? Well, if you all want to know a whole lot about drugs, the good and the bad, there's this website called drugsforum.com, and I use it a lot to find out what's going on in the world of illicit drugs, because I teach a lot of seminars on them. But users will actually get on this website and they will describe their highs for you. And then they will talk to you about how to concoct the best high, how to mix certain drugs. And even then, on this particular website, they know how dangerous the new synthetic fentanyls are, and they're saying even then, on the drug users forum, they're saying stay away from it. That's how bad it is. But this individual is describing his opioid high. And what he said, the high itself gives me intense euphoria. And I said that earlier. That's one reason why folks like them. I have a body high. That is like the icing on the cake. My whole body feels like it's having an orgasm, and stretching my body feels amazing. The pleasure is so high that I caught myself at one point drooling and nodding off. That's what they're looking for. So that's the perception of the good stuff. So now what about the bad stuff? You know, one thing that I teach in pharmacology with my paramedic and EMT students is every drug that we give has its side effects. Doesn't matter the drug, even oxygen has its side effects. But when individuals start taking opioids, of course, there's going to be some less than desirable side effects. The most common one that we deal with, because we're dealing with acute emergencies in EMT and paramedic, respiratory depression and apnea. When these opioids, when they bind to those opioid receptors in the central nervous system, the individual oftentimes stops breathing. That's what happens. If they take too much, they can stop breathing. And that's what apnea means. Okay? The facts, opioid attributed deaths 2014 to 2015, 47,000 people died from drug overdoses in 2014. But this is another fact that blew me away. And this was that in 2015, for the very first time, heroin overdoses surpassed homicides from guns. That kind of blew me away, because in the news, that's all you hear about are homicides from guns. That's all you hear about. The drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, with over 52,000 lethal drug overdoses in 2015. And again, the first time it surpassed those homicides from guns. Opioid deaths in 2015, over 20,000. Heroin deaths, over 12,000. Indeed, there is a crisis, ladies and gentlemen. So this is what I want to talk to you now about how overdose occurs. Again, once that opioid, whether natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic, when it binds to those opioid receptors in the brain, what happens is slowed breathing occurs. Ultimately, it can lead to breathing stops. When breathing stops, the brain's not getting oxygen, the heart's not getting oxygen, the lungs aren't getting oxygen. Lack of oxygen can lead to brain damage and the heart stopping, and then ultimately it can result in death. That's how it works. Now let's talk about why we may be seeing an opioid problem in the United States. Well, they think it's multifaceted. Number one, the fact that there's a greater social acceptability for using medications for different purposes. And in fact, it has been postulated that the United States is probably the most overly prescribed nation on the planet. Aggressive marketing by pharmaceutical companies. For those of you who may or may not have been around physician offices, you may be aware of pharmaceutical reps coming in and bringing food and goodies, perks, tickets to concerts, all this stuff in order to sell a drug or to get a physician to prescribe that drug. No more, that's since changed. But aggressive marketing by pharmaceutical companies. And then finally, drastic increases in the number of prescriptions written and dispensed. Now, an interesting fact that I found a while ago, the U.S. only makes about 4.5% of the world's population, and yet we consume 81% of the world's supply of oxycodone. Wow. That says a lot, doesn't it? Either Americans don't like pain, or we can't handle pain, or we really, really like the sensation that the opioids give us. So where are they getting them? Where are they getting the opioids? Well, the first and most obvious answer is from prescriptions. That's the first and most obvious. But of course, they can also get them from the streets. And did you know, I was sort of nosing around on Google not too long ago, and I wanted to know how much people are paying for one pill of oxycodone, or one pill of OxyContin, or Vicodin, or Percocet. Any guesses how much they're going for? One pill? Yeah, about 25 bucks. 25 to 35 bucks. Reagan, you said that awful quickly. I'm kind of worried about that. You might be a little yeah, 25 to 35 bucks per pill is what they're going for on the streets. They're also available on the internet. And I tell you what, you can get anything on the internet. Shoot, when I was back a few years ago, when I was doing my seminars on bath salts and K2, it was easy. It took me 2 clicks, and I could get to a website where I could order bath salts and K2. 2 clicks is all it took. Various types of pill mills, friends and family. I know hospice nurses that were around a lot of opioids and kind of helped themselves to some of those opioids that were prescribed to hospice patients. Stealing from emergency departments, nursing homes. So in essence, they're everywhere. And I can guarantee that if any one of you in this room wanted to get your hand on an opioid, you could. You could. I just hope that you don't. Healthcare providers wrote over 259 million prescriptions for painkillers in 2012. Seems like a lot, but a better way to really conceptualize this is by noting that that is enough for every American adult to have a bottle of pills. So every American adult to have a bottle of pills. In 2015, and this is the most recent data that I could find about opioids, nearly 92 million United States adults, or about 38% of the population, took legitimately prescribed opioid like OxyContin in 2015. Okay, and the reason why I'm giving you all the statistical data is to drive home that this is a problem in the United States. And that's about 1 in 3 Americans, mind you. Now, what I have heard time and time again is it's the doctor's fault. It's the doctor's fault. They should not be prescribing so many opioids. Well, perhaps that may be true and that may be a valid point. But the bottom line is that is another topic for another day. And I can assure you that if any one of you wanted to get your hands on an opioid, you could, and you didn't have to have a doctor's prescription to do it. So, the black market, as I said before, all opioids are available for purchase on the streets and the internet, and I'm going to show you that. I'm going to prove it to you on the next slide. Again, they're selling for 25 bucks a pill or sometimes $1 a milligram. Just depends. So let me ask you this, true or false? There's a street drug that is 10,000 times more potent than morphine. True or false? Man, morphine's awful potent, isn't it? The answer is true. And this is the new and synthetic drug that I want you all to be aware of. It is a drug that is called W18. W18. And it's a synthetic opioid, and I'll tell you where it's coming from. It's coming from basements, if you will, in China. And China is shipping them to Mexico, and Mexico is getting them across the border to the United States. This first batch of W18 was found in Alberta, Canada. It is so new, it has not been given an FDA schedule yet. A Schedule I drug means that it has no medicinal uses or purposes. This has not been scheduled yet. It probably will be. But it's called W18, and there's also another name for it. The name escapes me. Let me get it here. Oh, Shady 80s, also called Shady 80s, just so you know. Ladies and gentlemen, this will kill you. This drug will kill you. And I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. The other one I want you to be on the lookout for is carfentanil. Again, this is a new synthetic drug. It is now on the market. It's very similar to 2018, but this in fact is a true opioid, whereas W18 may have some other stuff in it besides just the opioid or synthetic opioid itself, may other stuff in it. This is a true opioid. And in fact, what they have labeled carfentanil as the most powerful commercial opioid out there. And in fact, it is so powerful. Does anyone know what it's actually used for? To sedate large animals, namely elephants. That's how potent it is. Marketed under the name as Wildnil. It's a general anesthetic for large animals, namely elephants. And this has been scheduled. This is a Schedule II drug. And in essence, what that means, it has a high potential for abuse. High potential for abuse. And this is, again, very, very bad stuff. And I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to a police officer in Ohio. Police officer made a traffic stop, and in the traffic stop he noted that the driver and the passenger, there was a lot of white powdery looking stuff in the vehicle. Bottom line is the two were arrested, took him to jail, went back to the police headquarters, and one of the fellow police officers, hey man, you've got some powder on your uniform. And without even thinking about it, he took it and he swiped it off, and in about 30 minutes later, he was almost dead. That's what carfentanil is. It is so potent, the touch of a finger almost killed this police officer. That's how potent this stuff is. Stay away from carfentanil. Stay away from W18. It is dangerous. It is deadly. It will kill you. As if K2, bath salts, crocodile wasn't bad enough, this, my friends, is much, much worse. And here's my proof. You know how many clicks it took me to get to this website? 2 or 3 clicks at the most. And what does it say? Buy oxycodone online, 40 milligrams. And that's what makes it so easy. That's what makes it so easy. You can just buy about anything on the internet. Now, why is that not going down? Okay, so mom and dads out there, watch what sons and daughters are doing on the internet and which websites they're visiting and ordering from. Legal, isn't that funny? Legal online pharmacy, just in case if we were wondering if it was legal or not legal. So the answer is, is there a real opioid crisis in the United States? Indeed there is. Indeed there is. And I've got a video that I would like to show to wrap up this seminar.
To France, yesterday's attacks and other things.
Some say that he does have ties to Muslim extremists. I don't know.
Illegal drug use in the U.S. is reaching epidemic levels. All across the country, individuals, families, communities, and healthcare systems are struggling to cope with the problem that is ruining the future of many young people and ending lives prematurely and tragically. In 2013, an estimated 25 million Americans were illicit drug users. The drugs used included marijuana, cocaine, heroin, hallucinogens, inhalants, and prescription-type psychotherapeutics. Among whites, illegal drug use increased to 9.5% from 8.5% in less than a decade. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there are currently about 500,000 people addicted to heroin in the U.S. The survey found that more than 9 in 10 people were using the drug alongside at least one other drug. The increased availability and lower price of heroin has been identified as a potential contributor to the rising rates of use. According to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the amount of heroin seized each year has quadrupled from 500 kilograms from 2002 to 2008 to 2,196 kilograms in 2013. The Drug Enforcement Administration's findings warn of a greatly expanding public health crisis due to the use and abuse of heroin and other drugs. In a statement, DEA Acting Administrator Chuck Rosenberg said, "We tend to overuse words such as unprecedented and horrific, but the death and destruction connected to heroin and opioids is indeed unprecedented and horrific. The problem is enormous and growing, and all of our citizens need to wake up to these facts." In February 2016, President Obama asked Congress for $1.1 billion in new funding to address the epidemic of prescription opioid and heroin abuse in his country. But it's not just opioids and heroin. Fatal overdoses and abuses of other drugs are also soaring. Time magazine has collected data on cocaine, benzodiazepines, and stimulants like crystal meth. All three categories have also risen dramatically since the year 2000. Statistics show that every day in the U.S. there is an average of 7,800 new drug users, which adds up to about 3 million a year. Of all American addicts, more than 60% are men and the rest women. A near 70% are white, followed by Hispanics, African Americans, and others. Figures show that the addicts are from all age groups, from 12 to over 50. At the National RX Drug Abuse and Heroin Summit in Atlanta in March 2016, President Obama called further attention to the drug epidemic in America.
That when you look at the staggering statistics in terms of lives lost, productivity impacted, costs to communities, but most importantly, cost to families, from this epidemic of opioids abuse, it has to be something that is right up there at the top of our radar screen. You mentioned the number 28,000. It's important to recognize that today we are seeing more people killed because of opioid overdose than traffic accidents. Now you think about that.
According to the latest reports and statistics, 1 in 5 young adults in 2014 were users of illicit drugs. Marijuana was the drug most new illicit drug users begin with, followed by prescription pain relievers and then inhalants. $700 billion is the amount the abuse of tobacco, alcohol, and illicit drugs costs to Americans annually in costs related to crime, lost work productivity, and healthcare. The amount the business of recovery has increased by 3 times in the last 25 years. Currently, there are about 14,000 addiction treatment facilities in the country. The annual revenue generated by the addiction treatment industry adds up to $35 billion. 11% of Americans in 2013 who needed treatment for an addiction problem actually received one. All these staggering figures reveal one thing in common: U.S. failure in its so-called war on drugs, both at the national and international level. At home, the U.S. government has been unable to close down the drug pipeline. It has also failed to quell popular desire for illegal drugs. In 1980, about 40,000 people were in U.S. jails and prisons for drug crimes. Now it's about 500,000 people, a disproportionate number of African Americans and other people of color. A 2015 Pew Research survey found that more than half of respondents favor the legal use of marijuana, while 44% are opposed. Nearly a decade ago, in 2006, just 1/3 supported marijuana legalization, while nearly twice as many were opposed. But more importantly, the U.S. has failed at the international front. Fighting narcotics has long been justifying the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. But now it has become clear U.S. officials have had no serious interest in tackling drug problems. Since 2001, the U.S. has spent over $700 billion on the war in Afghanistan. Of this number, only $7 billion have been spent on counter-narcotics operations there. In other words, the so-called drug war in Afghanistan accounts for a mere 1% of the total expenses. John Sopko, the Special Inspectors General who assesses American programs in Afghanistan, summarizes the U.S. war on drugs in Afghanistan this way: by every conceivable metric, we have failed. Production and cultivation are up, interdiction and eradication are down, financial support to the insurgency is up, and addiction and abuse are at unprecedented levels in Afghanistan. The 2015 World Drug Report notes that Afghanistan still accounts for about 80% of the global opiate and heroin production. When the U.S. attacked Afghanistan in 2001, that year's opium production was a mere 180 tons. Since then, it has reached record harvests of over 7,000 tons in 2007 and over 6,000 tons in 2014. Over the past decades, it has turned out that reducing drug problems is not a strategic objective of the U.S. establishment. On the contrary, impunity and support for drug lords and warlords has been the norm since 2001. A New York University report documented the use by NATO and U.S. forces of private security companies and militias that are often run by strongmen responsible for human rights abuses or involved in narcotics. After years of political hypocrisy, the chickens have come home to roost. The U.S. is in the grip of a drug epidemic now, and illegal drugs are targeting American society as never before.
One other thing, and then we can call it a day. I didn't mention earlier that law enforcement personnel and paramedics, we have the ability to treat opioid overdoses and reverse the effect of opioids by a drug called Narcan. And increasingly so, they're giving law enforcement officials training on how to use that opioid reversal agent, and they're using it with a tremendous success. I just wanted to throw that in there. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.